Hello, today we'll be talking about social psychology, more specifically, the aspects of social psychology that are social cognition and social influence. And this will be presented by me, Nikki. Okay, so social psychology, which is the major branch of this presentation, is the branch of psychology that focuses on how people's emotions, psychological condition, and even physical condition can be influenced by and are influenced by and can influence others. And again, as I mentioned before, we will be talking about social cognition and social influence. In other words, social psychology is talking about interpersonal relationships and how people are affected by others and how they themselves affect others. Social cognition is, as the textbook puts it, mental processes through which people understand and or react to others or vice versa. And we will go into more detail about this. So first of all, it is important to note that unlike other branches of psychology that are rooted in, for example, neural or more scientific evidence, there are no objective measures by which to measure a person's worth, which is basically what social psychology is measuring. And as such, people use social comparison, which affects either their self-concept, which is basically how one views themselves, or self-esteem, which is one's own evaluation of self-worth. And again, both self-concept and self-esteem are based on how the person relates to those around them. Again, interpersonal relationships. So when I refer to other people as examples of how to be, people use reference groups. In other words, people that are often used as a societal benchmark. And for example, these sort of people can be celebrities or also people that are seen as ideal. And a failure to see oneself in accordance with such ideals or such people can result in relative deprivation. In other words, it can result in internal discomfort or displeasure, and it can also result in psychological problems. The social identity theory was a theory proposed by Henry Tashev and John Turner, in which they claim that each person is constantly trying to gain acceptance in groups and society. So as seen in the chart on the right, people use social identity as a way to define themselves and their own self-worth. And in order to do so, they try to find groups. In this case, it would be an in-group in which to identify themselves. They try to find people similar to themselves who will accept them and as such become part of their groups. Turner and Tajev propose that this is crucial to a human and that as such they need to be able to find groups that identify themselves and can accept them. And the social identity theory is basically saying that social identity is the reason why humans constantly strive to be part of groups or to be accepted by others. On the other hand, social perception is the process through which people interpret others and form conclusions and impressions about them. Again, like the social cognition, this is the mental processes through which people identify with others. And these are often controlled by schemas, first impressions, attribution, errors in attributions, and self-protective functions. Each of these 5 things I will go into more detail about later on in later slides. First of all, schemas. Schemas, as we learned earlier, are mental representations of a situation or person that a person already has when they meet a new situation. These can include expectations based on previous experiences or biases and prejudices and such. And schemas can affect a person's attention towards specific things, how they remember events, and what they remember. In other words, schemas are a person's bias. The negative part about schemas is that they can create self-fulfilling prophecies in which one's behavior is influenced by their expectations. As such, when people interact with other people, they might be more governed by their expectations of what that person will act like or do, perhaps based on their appearance or what the person believes that specific appearance will entail, and as such believe in a specific way towards that person. An example like that would be an example in which the person is controlled by their pre-existing schemas. First impressions are very similar to schemas, and they are mostly influenced by schemas. And as such, they're not easily changed because, like schemas, they are based on pre-existing biases and expectations. Attribution is the process of explaining causes of behavior, why people react to certain situations the way they do, certain situations or certain people. And attribution can both be internal or external. So let me explain that a little bit. An internal cause would be, for example, a person's morality or a person's personality, characteristics, and traits, while as an external cause of behavior would be one that's out of their control, perhaps the climate, the weather, or just luck in general. So, attribution can be explained through consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness. Consensus is whether or not the majority of others hold the same behavior or responses. For example, if a man really hates another person, consensus would be if everyone else also hates that person. And as such, the cause of behavior will be external, as it would prove that his hatred of that one person is not only specific to his own personality traits. However, if no one else feels the same way, the cause of behavior will be internal, as it means that his hatred is only based on his own perspectives and schemas of that person. Consistency is whether the behavior is consistent across time or situations, whether a person's behavior in specific events changes over time or in different places. Distinctiveness is whether one particular response differs from others in similar situations. For example, again, if you're using the example of a person hating another, if that person claimed to not like a specific clown, distinctiveness would be whether or not the person hates all clowns or just that one specific clown. So although they are all similar, distinctiveness looks at whether or not it is consistent over different individual events. Errors in attribution can also be crucial in determining how people interact with each other, and they can be affected by errors that distort behavior. For example, the fundamental attribution error, the ultimate attribution error, the actor-observer effect, or the self-serving bias. The fundamental attribution error is over-attributing others' behavior to internal causes, whereas the ultimate attribution error is attributing outgroups' negative behaviors internally caused, while positive behaviors externally caused. In other words, the ultimate attribution error says that if a person who is outside of one's own social group displays negative behavior, then one will be more likely to say that their negative behavior is caused by their own negative personality traits, whereas their positive behavior could only be externally caused, in such words, out of their control. In other words, in simpler terms, it means that people are more likely to believe in the evilness of others than their own good. The observer-actor bias effect is attributing others' behavior to internal causes while seeing one's own behavior as externally caused, meaning that they see other people's behavior as caused by their own personalities, whereas seeing one's own behavior being caused by either luck or exterior circumstances. Self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute successes to internal traits while blaming failures on external situations. In other words, the self-serving bias is saying that successes are more likely to be put as caused by one's own hard work or perhaps perseverance, whilst failures are based on the mistakes of others. So more about in-groups and out-groups before we go on further about the ways in which people's behavior can be distorted. In-groups are those similar to oneself or that belong to the same group of people. In other words, in-groups are the people who accept you. And within in-groups, there is the contact hypothesis, which states that prejudice can be reduced the more one has contact with an in-group. So prejudice is caused when one cannot identify with another group, when one has problem assimilating to the group. However, the hypothesis states that if one continually comes into contact with that group, the prejudice will be reduced. Outgroups are those foreign to oneself that are discriminated against for not being in the in-group. Outgroups are what causes bias and prejudice in society. Since people cannot identify with outgroups, they are discriminated against for being different. Psychology proposes that in-groups and out-groups are created to reduce social complexity and allow people to feel acceptance. By finding their in-groups, people gain acceptance with people similar to themselves. However, in-groups and out-groups can also be the reason behind societal bias and prejudice. Self-protective functions are protective functions that one takes to alter one's own behavior to protect oneself from revealing traits they see as negative. In other words, they distort their own behavior in order to appear a certain way to others. Okay, so attitudes. Attitude is how one responds to particular situations, and they are most commonly the result of beliefs, feelings, and or actions. In other words, attitudes are strongly influenced by previous experiences or beliefs. And they can also be learned through classical operant conditioning or the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is the effect of merely being exposed to a particular situation. So attitude can be learned through observation of how other people react to situations, and as such, it will be learned through mere exposure to the particularly expected behavior or response. So there are three major attitude theories, which are the elaboration likelihood model, the cognitive dissonance theory, and the self-perception theory. The elaboration likelihood model states that attitude change based on the person's ability or motivation to do so. As such, it says that attitude can be changed if the person wishes to do so, and as such, it is something that can be controlled by the person themselves. The cognitive dissonance theory states that if a discrepancy between attitude and behavior is created, the person will be motivated to change one. This theory more specifically states that the person will be motivated to change their attitude. So if the way one is acting and one is feeling is not on the same par, then the person will feel internal psychological discomfort and will change their attitude. The self-perception theory states that attitude can change when people use behavior as clues to what their attitudes are. So again, like the cognitive dissonance theory, it states that behavior and attitude are intricately entwined and that they come hand in hand. So in the self-perception theory, attitude changes when someone sees the behavior of others and uses it as motivation to change their own. In other words, observational is the best way to change one's attitude. Attraction, which is a major component of interpersonal relationships, are also a way in which people can influence others and are influenced. The matching hypothesis states that people tend to choose others whose physical attractiveness is equal to their own in long-term relationships. Whilst in short-term relationships, initial attraction is often more commonly skewed towards those who are physically active. So those who are fit may appear the more attractive in the short term, but matching levels of physical attractiveness is more important in the long term. But besides that, attraction is most often greater between people who share characteristics or similar personality traits. Sternberg produced a triangular theory, which proposed that love is composed of passion, intimacy, and commitment, and that different combinations of passion, intimacy, and commitment will result in different types of love. As seen in the graph on the right, different combinations can form either romantic love, companion love, or fatuous love. In other words, lust, whereas the consummate love would be a combination of all three. And this is important because the triangular theory proposes that passion, intimacy, and commitment are the things that can most affect a person's type of interpersonal relationship and how they are influencing each other's attraction. Social norms are societal rules for appropriate behavior, and note the previous slide on attitude. So social norms can also determine the appropriate attitude to specific situations. For example, an attitude that one must act on at a funeral would be one of grief or sadness, and as such, the behavior that one exhibits at such an occasion influences their attitude towards the occasion. So, back to social norms. Social norms can result in de-individuation, in which people in a group lose identity to conform to norms. In other words, they lose individuality to conform to an in-group. Conformity is when a person changes as a result of peer pressure or just unspoken pressure, whereas compliance is when a person changes as a result of spoken request. In other words, compliance is when a person is verbally told they must change. Conformity is less explicit. Descriptive norms are norms that give people pressure to act the same as others, whereas injunctive norms are information of what people disapprove or approve of. Descriptive norms will more likely be explicit in compliance, whereas injunctive norms will more be explicit in conformity due to the fact that descriptive norms are explicit pressure and injunctive norms are just unspoken information. So social psychology also looks at the reason why people help each other. There is the arousal cost reward theory, which says that people help others to soothe their own discomfort at others' distress. As such, it can be concluded that society sees people as implicitly motivated to help others. People are innately kind and innately compassionate towards others. The empathy altruism theory also states that helping is unselfish when a person feels empathy for the person they're helping. However, based on the Russell cost reward theory, which states that people basically are empathetic creatures, it would seem that the empathy altruism theory is a bit obvious. On the other hand, there is competition. Again, this leads to the difference between in-groups and out-groups and the prejudice and bias that is caused as a result of such societal groups. These can cause societal dilemmas. Short-term selfish behavior harms the entire group in the long run. For example, a person might refrain from interacting with an out-group due to discrimination. However, it harms the entire group in the long term, as one can see from the prejudice in widespread society today. And also competition states that when given the choice of choosing between cooperating or competing, people usually choose to compete. So this also leads back to the in-group and out-group theory, in which people innately want to be accepted by others, and as such, they discriminate against those they do not identify with or agree with. In conclusion, Human interactions and behaviors are the result of societal pressure and innate desire for the acceptance or positive acclaim in communities. Thank you.